Paige Lawson hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, but she'd learned a long time ago that hunger was quieter than pride, so she didn't mention it to anyone. She was 27, worked the VIP floor at the Alabaster, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, the kind of place where a single bottle of wine cost more than her rent, and the guests never looked the staff in the eye. She'd been doing this for 4 years, smiling at people who didn't see her, clearing plates that still had more food on them than she'd eat in a week, and she'd gotten so good at being invisible that sometimes she wondered if she'd disappeared for real. Her mother had died 2 years ago in a hospital bed that smelled like bleach and resignation, leaving behind nothing but $180,000 in medical debt that Paige was still paying off $11.40 an hour at a time. Most nights, she fell asleep on a mattress on the floor of a 300-square-foot studio, with a nursing textbook open on her chest, because the desk she couldn't afford didn't exist. That was her life, small and hard and honest. And she'd made something close enough to peace with it to get through a shift without falling apart, until the night the Valetti family booked the private dining room on the 6th floor. She didn't know who they were, not really, but she'd heard the name the way everyone in the city had, in whispers, in warnings, in the careful silence that fell over the kitchen when her boss told the staff that tonight's service was to be flawless and forgettable. Corbin Valetti arrived first, 37, tall, a faint scar through his left eyebrow, wearing a black suit with no tie and the kind of stillness that dangerous men carry when they've got nothing left to prove. His mother, Lorraine, came in behind him, 62. Silver hair pinned up, a single strand of pearls at her throat, and she did something Paige hadn't seen a VIP guest do in 4 years. She looked directly at Paige, said thank you, and meant it. Then came Tristan, the younger brother, 33, softer edges, and beside him his wife, Monica, 30 years old, beautiful in a way that made you want to trust her before she'd earned it. With a smile Paige had seen 1,000 times on 1,000 different faces in this restaurant, warm at the edges, completely controlled at the center. Paige served the courses, poured the wine, disappeared into the wallpaper the way she always did, and everything was fine. Everything was normal, until 9:47 that evening, when she was standing in the service corridor behind the frosted glass panel that let the staff see into the dining room without being seen, and she saw something she wasn't supposed to see, something that no amount of money could make her unsee, and she had exactly 3 seconds to decide what kind of person she was going to be. If this story hits you somewhere real, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that corridor, 9:47, because Paige Lawson was standing there with a tray in her hands and a decision that was about to shake one of the most powerful families in this city to its foundation. Through the frosted glass, Paige saw Monica rise from the dining table. No one noticed. Corbin was talking to Lorraine, his voice low and even, one hand resting on the black oak tabletop. Tristan was looking at his phone, his thumb moving slowly across the screen. Monica moved toward the side table where the dessert plates had already been arranged, her steps light and natural, as though she was only getting up to make herself more comfortable, maybe to stretch her back, maybe to admire the white lilies on the windowsill, nothing worth noticing at all. But Paige had spent 4 years standing in the corners of rooms, watching rich people, and she knew the difference between someone rising for comfort and someone rising with a purpose. Monica had a purpose. Her back turned just enough to block the view from the main table, not completely turning away because that would look strange, only angling herself enough for her shadow to cover the right hand that was moving. Paige saw that hand, saw it stop over one particular plate. The panna cotta plate with a small L, written in edible ink along the lower rim, the plate the kitchen had prepared separately, because Lorraine Valetti was allergic to nuts, and her dessert had to be made with a different recipe. Paige knew that plate. She was the one who had carried it up from the kitchen. She was the one who had arranged every plate on the side table in the exact serving order, and she was the one standing there now, watching Monica Hale Valetti open her clutch purse with her left hand, take out something small, almost invisible, and tilt her right hand lightly over the plate marked L, while her eyes didn't look down at her own hand, but swept across the room, checking every face, every sightline, making sure no one was watching. No one was watching, except Paige. 3 seconds. That was all it took. 3 seconds from the moment Monica opened the clutch to the moment she closed it again, slipped something back inside, and stepped aside, her right hand brushing the edge of the table as though she was merely touching the tablecloth because her fingers had nothing better to do. 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Paige Lawson stood in the service hallway with a tray of panna cotta in her hands, and her entire body froze. Not from fear. Or maybe it was fear, but it hadn't arrived yet. It was waiting in line behind something else, something older and deeper, something she didn't have time to name, but it had the shape of a hospital room and the smell of bleach and a woman lying in a bed whom no one looked at twice. She could go back to the kitchen, set the tray down, tell Carlton she had a stomachache and needed to leave early, come to work tomorrow morning like normal, pretend she hadn't seen anything, the same way she had pretended not to see anything for 4 years in this restaurant, the same way the world had pretended not to see her mother through the final 6 months in the hospital. She could do that. It would be easy. It would be safe. And a woman who was 62, a woman who had looked straight into her eyes and said thank you, as if she were a human being and not furniture, would eat that plate. Paige pushed open the hallway door. She stepped into the private dining room through the service entrance. On the left, the corner guests never looked toward because that was where food appeared, and food didn't need to be noticed. She set the tray down on the side table, right beside the panna cotta plates, and began doing what she did every day, arranging. She lifted the first dessert spoon and straightened it, lifted the second, turned the tray slightly to align the angle, and in that motion, in that familiar rhythm that 4 years of serving had carved into her muscles so deeply she could have done it in her sleep, her left hand lifted the plate marked L out of its place, and her right hand set an unmarked plate where it had been. The clean L plate, the plate the kitchen had prepared especially for Lorraine, was now in the place of an ordinary plate. The plate Monica had touched, the plate marked L, with something added to it that Paige didn't want to name, now sat at the center of the side table, in the shared position, belonging to no one in particular. No one saw. Monica had returned to the main table, her hand holding Tristan's beneath the table, laughing at something Corbin had just said. Lorraine was sipping her wine. Tristan was putting away his phone, and Paige Lawson, the waitress who made $11.40 an hour, had just switched 2 plates right in front of one of the most powerful families in the city, and not a single person in the room knew it had happened. For the first time in 4 years, she was grateful for being invisible. She carried dessert to the main table. The clean plate was set in front of Lorraine. Paige stepped back into the corner of the room, both hands folded behind her back, her face perfectly blank. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it, but no one heard. No one ever hears the heartbeat of a server. Tristan reached across the table. Just one simple, natural motion, the way a 33-year-old man sees a plate of panna cotta right in front of him, and thinks, why not? Paige stood in the corner of the room, watching his hand touch the plate at the center of the side table, the very plate she had placed there 30 seconds earlier, and she felt something drop inside her chest, falling slow and heavy, like a stone sinking into black water. She wanted to say something, wanted to open her mouth and say, "Sir, that plate is meant to be shared. Let me get you another one." Any sentence that could stop the spoon now rising toward his mouth. But she couldn't. Anything unusual at this moment, any attention she drew toward the dessert plates, would place a question mark over what she had just done. And if Monica was watching, if Monica was counting plates or remembering positions, then a waitress suddenly interfering with the food in front of a guest would be a sign brighter than a neon light. So Paige stayed still. She stayed still and watched Tristan Valetti lift the spoonful of panna cotta to his mouth and swallow, and she felt that spoon cut through her own throat. Monica saw it too. Paige knew because she was watching Monica from the corner of her eye, and in the moment Tristan raised the spoon, there was the smallest shift on Monica's face. Not panic, not fear, but something like a calculation returning the wrong answer, like when you press a calculator button a second time and realize the numbers don't match. She couldn't stop her husband. She couldn't say don't eat that plate without having to explain why, and Monica Hale Valetti was clearly not the kind of woman who explained anything unless she controlled the answer. So she stayed still too. 2 women at opposite ends of the room, one in the corner in a server's uniform, and the other at the main table in a champagne-colored dress, both silent, both knowing something no one else in the room knew, and the spoon had touched his lips. 12 minutes. That was how long it took before it began. 12 minutes that Paige counted 1 second at a time by the clock hanging in the kitchen, which she could see through the crack of the service door. 12 minutes in which she refilled Lorraine's water and cleared the remaining appetizer plates and kept her hands busy so they wouldn't tremble. 12 minutes in which she wondered whether she had been wrong, whether Monica had only been wiping the plate or touching the table edge, or doing any harmless thing Paige could tell herself, so this night could end normally. Then Tristan set down his wineglass and gripped the edge of the table, slowly, as if he needed the table to keep himself upright. His face changed color, not gradually, but almost all at once, from flush to gray-white, the kind of white Paige had seen exactly once before, on her mother's face in the emergency room at 4 o'clock in the morning on a winter Tuesday. Sweat broke out across Tristan's forehead. He said something to Monica, but the words were swallowed halfway through, the syllables collapsing over one another, and Monica placed a hand on her husband's arm and said, "Sweetheart, are you all right?" Her voice perfectly worried, her eyes open just wide enough, her brows drawn together at exactly the right angle, and Paige stood in the corner of the room, watching that performance, and felt sick in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with food. Corbin reacted before Monica's call had finished. He stood, and the chair pushed back and slid across the wooden floor without a sound because the carpet was thick, but the speed with which he rose made its own sound. It said this was a man whose protective instincts didn't need time to think. He was beside Tristan in 2 steps, his hand on his younger brother's shoulder, his voice low and clear as he asked, "What do you feel? What did you eat? What did you drink?" Tristan tried to answer, but the words were dissolving. He said, "I don't know. Everything is spinning," and one of his hands clutched Corbin's sleeve like a child clinging to his older brother on a playground. Corbin didn't call 911. He took out his phone and pressed a single number, said 2 sentences Paige couldn't hear clearly, then put the phone away. The family doctor. Of course. The Valetti family didn't invite strangers into rooms with closed doors. They had their own people, their own system, their own way of handling things, and the police or an ambulance or anything with red and blue flashing lights was not on the invitation list. Monica helped Tristan to his feet, one arm wrapped around her husband's waist, her face truly the face of a frightened wife. And if Paige hadn't known what she knew, she would have believed it too. Monica was good. She was good enough to be terrifying. But there was one moment, only one, while Monica was guiding Tristan across the room toward the door, when her eyes slipped sideways and met Paige's. 1 second. Less than 1 second. And in that look there was nothing specific. No acknowledgement, no accusation, only the vague feeling of an animal running and suddenly catching a wrong scent in the wind. Monica didn't know yet. She didn't know what Paige had seen, didn't know the plate had been switched, didn't know the woman standing in the corner in a black uniform and white apron was not furniture, but the only witness to what she had just done. But she felt something, and that was enough for Paige to tighten both hands behind her back and keep her face emptier than ever. Tristan was taken out of the room. Monica followed, her heels tapping evenly on the wooden floor, her back straight, one hand still resting against her husband's back. The door closed. The private dining room became very large and very quiet in the way a room only becomes quiet when there are too few people for too much space. Corbin stood in the middle of the room, phone in hand, staring at the door his younger brother had just passed through. Then he left too, quickly, without looking back. Lorraine remained. She sat exactly where she had been sitting all evening, her back straight, the simple strand of pearls at her throat, her glass of wine nearly untouched. She didn't stand, didn't call anyone, didn't ask what had happened to her son. She looked down at the table, looked at the dessert plate still sitting there almost untouched, and Paige, from the corner of the room, saw that look. It wasn't panic, it wasn't surprise. It was the look of a 62-year-old woman who had built an empire from nothing and kept it standing through her husband's death, and 15 years of men looking at her as if she were only the shadow of the man who was gone. And she was looking at the dessert plate on the table, with the eyes of someone who had suspected something for a long time, and had just watched that suspicion take root into something heavier and truer and more dangerous. Lorraine didn't move for 20 minutes after the door closed. Paige knew because she had counted, standing in the corner of the room with both hands folded behind her back, her legs beginning to ache and her heartbeat still not back to normal, counting each minute on the kitchen clock through the crack of the service door, while the 62-year-old woman sat alone in the middle of a room filled with white candles and lilies and dessert plates. No one wanted to eat anymore. Paige should have cleared the table. That was her job. The reason she was in this room. And Carlton would want to know why the private dining room hadn't been cleaned by 10:30 at night. But she couldn't walk toward that table, not because she was afraid, because she didn't know what she would say if Lorraine asked. Lorraine asked. She didn't look up when she spoke. her voice soft and flat like the surface of water you knew was very deep underneath. "Come here, girl." Paige walked to the table. Her legs were stiff and heavy, and she had to command each step one by one. Lorraine still hadn't looked up. She was looking at the plate in the center of the side table, the plate Tristan had eaten from, the plate with the L on the lower rim, where now there was only a white smear of panna cotta and a spoon lying at an angle. Then she looked up. Her eyes met Paige's, and Paige understood at once that she knew. Not everything, not the details, but enough. She knew in the way a person who had lived 62 years, in a world where trust was a luxury and betrayal was the cost of doing business, knew when something was wrong at her own dining table. "You rearranged the plates," Lorraine said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, flat and precise, and leaving no room for denial. "Didn't you?" Paige swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Silence. Lorraine tilted her head slightly to one side, a small motion, almost invisible, but it changed the entire weight of the conversation. "Why?" One word. There was no question in her voice. Or if there was, it lay very deep, buried beneath the layer of control that 62 years and an empire had built. Paige looked at the woman sitting before her, the simple strand of pearls, the silver hair without a single strand out of place, her back straight in the chair as if her spine had been cast from something harder than bone, and she told the truth because she had nothing else to say. And because lying to this woman felt like a form of suicide she wasn't brave enough to attempt. "Because I saw something I shouldn't have seen," Paige said, "and I didn't know what else to do except make sure it didn't reach you." Lorraine looked at her. For a long time. The kind of look Paige had never received from anyone in 4 years of working at the Alabaster. The kind of look that neither judged nor pitied, but weighed, measured the true weight of the person standing in front of her, and Paige endured that gaze without looking away because she was used to enduring things heavier than a stare. Lorraine reached into her coat pocket and placed a business card on the table. White, no name, no logo, only a phone number printed in black ink at the center. 10 digits, nothing else. "Don't tell anyone," Lorraine said. "Don't call this number unless someone comes looking for you." "And they will." She stood. The movement was slow and controlled. Not because she was weak, but because she was the kind of person who never hurried in front of anyone. She walked past Paige, close enough that Paige could smell her perfume. Light, old, the kind of scent a person stayed loyal to for an entire lifetime, and she said nothing more. The door to the private dining room opened. Corbin stood on the threshold. He had come back at some point, maybe just now. Maybe he had been standing there longer than Paige wanted to think. He looked at his mother first. Lorraine placed a hand on her son's arm, one brief touch, then stepped past him into the hallway. Corbin looked into the room, looked at the dining table, looked at the dessert plate, then looked at Paige. 3 seconds. She had counted 3 seconds so many times tonight that it was beginning to feel like the unit of measurement for things that changed a life. 3 seconds for Monica to put something on the plate, 3 seconds for Paige to decide to switch the plates. And now 3 seconds in which Corbin Valetti looked at her, gray eyes cold beneath the faint scar, and she didn't know what he was seeing, but she knew he was seeing more than a waitress. He said nothing. He turned his back and left. Paige stood alone in the Alabaster's private dining room, among white candles and lilies and white tablecloths, and the lingering scent of panna cotta, and she looked at the business card in her hand and realized her hands still hadn't started trembling. They waited. They waited until she changed out of her uniform, said goodnight to Carlton, stepped out the restaurant's back door, walked 4 blocks under the dull yellow streetlights, opened the door to her studio of 300 square feet, locked the door, set her purse on the floor, and sat down on the mattress on the floor. Then it came. Both her hands shook. Not a light tremble. Not the ordinary shaking of nerves, but the kind of shaking that came when her whole body finally allowed itself to feel what tonight really was. And what it was, Paige still couldn't find the word for, but it was large and dark, and it was sitting inside her chest like a living animal. She looked at the business card. 10 digits on white paper. No name. No promise. Only a thread tying her to a world she didn't belong to and had never meant to enter. She could tear it up, throw it in the trash with the empty instant noodle cup and this month's hospital bill. Wake up tomorrow morning, find a new job, pay down her debt, study nursing, forget tonight, forget the panna cotta plate, forget Lorraine's eyes, forget the 3 seconds Corbin Valetti had looked at her as if she were an equation he hadn't solved yet. She could do all of that, But Paige had watched enough people be abandoned in her life to know she wouldn't be the next person to abandon someone else. She placed the business card against her chest, lay down, stared at the ceiling, at the familiar crack running from the left corner to the light bulb in the middle of the room, and she didn't sleep. 2 days passed, and Paige didn't call the number on the business card. She went to work, wiped tables, poured water, cleared plates, smiled at faces that didn't look at her, and she did all of it, while the white business card lay in the back pocket of her jeans, like a hot coal she didn't dare pick up and didn't dare throw away. She couldn't sleep the first night. On the second night, she slept for 3 hours, then woke because she dreamed of the panna cotta plate, dreamed of Monica's hand moving over its surface, and in the dream, Paige didn't switch the plates in time. In the dream, Lorraine lifted the spoon to her mouth, and Paige stood behind the frosted glass screaming, but no sound came out of her throat. She woke at 4 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the mattress in the dark, and realized she was waiting for the thing Lorraine had said would come. It came on the third day, at 5:45 in the evening, while Paige was wiping table number 7 in preparation for dinner service. She heard the front door open, and she didn't need to look up to know this wasn't a guest with a reservation, because opening time hadn't come yet, and Carlton hadn't turned on the main lights, but she looked up anyway, and she saw the black SUV parked outside the glass door, large and polished and silent in the way expensive things are often silent, and the man who stepped through the door was so big he had to tilt one shoulder slightly so he wouldn't brush the frame. Beckett Shaw. She didn't know his name at the time. She only knew he was taller than any man she had ever served at the Alabaster, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair, and he wore his black suit the way people wore a uniform, not as fashion but as function, and he moved through the empty restaurant with the ease of a man accustomed to spaces that didn't belong to him. He stopped in front of Paige. Polite. That was the first thing she noticed, that he was polite. But it was the kind of politeness she had learned to recognize after 4 years serving powerful people, the kind dangerous men used when they didn't need to be dangerous but wanted you to know they could be. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice low and flat. "Mr. Valetti wants to see you." Paige set the cleaning cloth down on table number 7. She didn't ask which Mr. Valetti. She didn't ask why. She looked at the black SUV outside the glass door, and thought about the business card in the back pocket of her jeans, and thought about Lorraine saying they would come looking for her, and she nodded once, told Carlton she had to leave early, and stepped outside into the October evening. The SUV drove for 17 minutes through the city's financial district, the glass buildings rising taller and taller like a bar graph, and stopped in front of the tallest tower at the end of the avenue, the kind of building with no sign in the lobby because the people who lived here didn't need signs. People came looking for them, not the other way around. A private elevator. Beckett swiped a card, didn't press a button, and the elevator knew where to go. The top floor, the doors opened, and Paige stepped into Corbin Valetti's penthouse, and the first thing she thought was that it was empty. Not empty in the sense that there was no furniture. There was a sofa, a table, bookshelves, floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the entire city skyline. Empty in the sense that there were no traces of life. Bare concrete, clear glass, black steel, everything stripped down to something mercilessly minimal, as if the man who lived here had deliberately removed every piece of evidence that he was human and not an extension of these walls. The only personal thing on the bookshelf, between hardbound books whose authors Paige didn't recognize, was a photograph, framed in dark wood, without decoration. In the picture, a young woman was standing with her 2 young children, smiling down at them with a laugh not meant for the camera but for the 2 small living beings at her side. And Paige recognized Lorraine. Decades ago, her hair not yet silver, no pearls, just a young mother watching over her children and laughing. It was the only personal thing in the entire apartment, and it told Paige more than any expensive painting ever could. Corbin sat at the dining table. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't shake her hand, didn't invite her to sit. He only looked at her, and this was the first time Paige had seen Corbin Valetti in close light, the late afternoon daylight slanting through the glass, and she saw things the candlelight in the private dining room had hidden. The scar through his left eyebrow was clearer, longer than she had thought, cutting from the middle of the brow up close to the hairline. The shadows beneath his gray eyes, the kind of shadows that didn't come from one sleepless night, but from a sleepless life. His hands rested on the table, long-fingered, sharply boned. The kind of hands Paige couldn't decide were the hands of an artist or the hands of a man who had done things artists only wrote about. "Tell me," he said. Not please, not a gentle request. A command spoken in an ordinary voice, and Paige understood that this was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. She told him, briefly, precisely, no added emotion, no missing detail. She described where she had been standing, the angle of the frosted glass, Monica at the side table, the right hand over the plate marked L, the clutch opening and closing, 3 seconds. She described how she had switched the plates, which motion, what time, which plate went where. Then she stopped. Corbin listened without interrupting. No nodding, no frown, no reaction at all, only absorbing every word like a sponge taking in black water. When she stopped, he was silent for a while. Then he asked, and the question wasn't the one Paige had prepared for. Why did you interfere? Not what did you see, not where is the evidence. Why? Why would a waitress earning minimum wage in someone else's restaurant decide to place herself in the middle of a family whose name the whole city whispered? Paige looked at him, looked at the cold gray eyes beneath the scar, looked at the long hands on the tabletop, looked at the photograph of young Lorraine holding 2 babies on the shelf behind him, and she told the truth because she didn't know what else to say, and because for the second time in 3 days, she was sitting in front of someone from the Valetti family, and the truth was the only thing she had. Because I watched a woman die while no one did anything, she said. I won't let that happen again. Something moved across Corbin's face. Not much, not clearly, not the kind of expression ordinary people could read. But Paige had spent 4 years reading the faces of rich people, and she saw it. One moment when the layer of control thinned by barely 1/25 of an inch, and underneath it was surprise, real surprise, as if he had prepared for every answer except this one. Do you know you're in danger? He said. Paige almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the question itself. Coming from a man sitting in a penthouse worth millions of dollars, asking a woman carrying $180,000 in medical debt whether she knew she was in danger. I'm always in danger, she said. It's just a different kind. Silence. Corbin looked at her, and she looked back. And the room was too large and too empty for 2 people. And the evening light was fading through the glass, and no one said anything for 4 seconds, 5 seconds. And Paige didn't look away because she hadn't looked away in front of Lorraine, and she wouldn't look away in front of her son. Corbin said Monica was searching. She didn't know yet who had switched the plates, but she was asking, watching, narrowing the list, and when she found out, the person at the end of that list wouldn't be safe. He offered protection. An apartment owned by the family, security, until he handled the situation. Paige looked at him. I don't accept charity. This isn't charity, Corbin said, and his voice didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. This is me protecting the only witness who can help me understand who is trying to kill my mother. Witness. The word sat between them like a coin on the table, practical and cold and unromantic. And precisely because it wasn't romantic, Paige believed it. She set conditions. She would still go to work because she needed money to pay her debt. And she wouldn't sit in someone else's apartment waiting for someone else to fix her life. She didn't owe the Valetti family anything, and when everything was over, she would leave, go back to her life. Corbin looked at her for a while, as if he was translating what she said into a language he understood, the language of transactions and terms and boundaries, and then he nodded. Fine. Beckett took her to the apartment. 2 bedrooms, 9th floor, a quiet building in a middle-class neighborhood, not luxurious, not showy, normal enough that no one would ask questions. Paige stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. The windows were large enough to show the sky, not just a slice of it through the gap between 2 buildings, but a whole sky. And the living room was 4 times the size of her studio, and there was a desk, a real desk, a desk for studying, and there was a kitchen with a full-size refrigerator instead of the mini-fridge she had wedged under the sink. And she stood there, in the middle of a room someone had paid for so she could be safe. And what she felt wasn't gratitude. It was closer to anger. Anger that the world worked in such a way that one person had to nearly die from poisoning for another person to be allowed to stand in a room with windows large enough to see the sky. Corbin came for the first time on the 5th day after Paige moved into the apartment. He didn't knock. Beckett opened the door, and Corbin stepped across the threshold as if stepping into a conference room. Black suit, the shadows beneath his eyes darker than the last time she had seen him, and he placed a brown envelope on the table. The real table Paige still wasn't used to having. Tristan's toxicology results, he said, without sitting down. A sedative. Midazolam. A high dose, enough to make a 33-year-old man weighing 172 pounds, disoriented, and unable to control his movements for several hours. Paige looked at the envelope without opening it. She didn't need to read the name of the drug to understand what Corbin was saying next. That Lorraine was more than 44 pounds lighter than Tristan, 62 years old, with unstable blood pressure, and if she had taken that dose, the consequence wouldn't have been dizziness or slurred speech, but complete loss of consciousness, possibly temporary cognitive impairment, the kind of state in which a human being becomes a puppet, and anyone standing beside that puppet can put a pen in its hand and make it sign anything. Corbin said Monica knew the dosage. Not guessed, not tested, knew. She knew exactly how many milligrams for how many pounds of body weight, and she knew because Monica Hale Valetti wasn't only a beautiful woman with a college degree and a controlled smile. She was a former Army combat medic, 6 years in the military, 2 deployments, fully trained in pharmaceuticals, dosages, and how to keep a person alive, or how to make sure they couldn't hold themselves together. Paige listened and felt something tighten in her stomach. Not fear, but the realization that that night in the private dining room, she hadn't only been facing a jealous or greedy woman, she had been facing someone trained, and those 3 seconds when she switched the plates, 3 seconds of trembling and instinct, and the memory of her mother in a hospital bed, those 3 seconds had stopped a plan calculated by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Corbin said one more thing before he left. Lorraine had scheduled a meeting with Hugh Pemberton, the family's estate attorney, for the following week. Updating her will, restructuring assets, the kind of appointment that only happened when a person decided to rearrange everything before everything no longer belonged to her. If Lorraine lost consciousness at exactly the right time, if she was in a state where she couldn't make decisions just as the most important documents were being drafted, then the person standing beside her, the woman the whole family believed to be a loving daughter-in-law, would have a window to influence, to shift, to change lines of text that looked completely legal on paper but were theft in reality. Corbin didn't say the word theft. He didn't need to. He placed his hand on the brown envelope, looked at Paige, and said, "I'll come back," then left. The second time was 4 days later. This time, Corbin sat down. He sat at the table Paige had begun using to study, her nursing books and notebooks pushed to one side, and he opened a laptop between them. Nina Pryor. That name appeared for the first time in Paige's conversation with Corbin, and he spoke of her in the voice people use for a reliable instrument. No unnecessary adjectives, only function. The family's chief accountant. 44 years old. 12 years keeping the Valetti books. Accurate down to the last cent. Never exaggerating. And if Nina said there was a problem, then there was a problem. Nina had found a problem. $340,000. Moved through Tristan's account over 2 years. Not one large transfer that was easy to notice, but many small ones. Steady, patient. The kind of money movement that looked like ordinary living expenses if you looked at each transaction separately, but when Nina lined them up across time, the shape appeared as clearly as blood on snow. And Tristan didn't know. Paige asked to be sure, and Corbin confirmed it, his voice flat, his eyes not leaving the screen. His younger brother didn't know where the money in his account was flowing, because Monica managed the family finances, because Tristan trusted his wife, because in 4 years of marriage he had never had a reason to open a bank statement and read every line. Paige looked at the number on the screen and thought about the $180,000 in hospital debt she was paying back on $11.40 an hour, and thought that $340,000, the money Monica had moved while smiling at her husband's family over every dinner, was almost double the debt Paige had carried on her back for 2 years, and that nearly crushed her every day. "Why don't you deal with her now?" Paige said, and she heard her own voice come out harder than she had meant. "You have proof. You have Nina. You have me. Why don't you end it right now?" Corbin closed the laptop, slowly, looked at her. "Power isn't doing anything you want whenever you want," he said. "Power is choosing the right thing at the right time." He didn't say it like philosophy, but like fact, like someone who had lived by that principle long enough to know it was true and was tired enough not to want to explain why. He left. Paige sat there with the table and the nursing textbook, and $340,000 floating inside her head, and the phrase "the right thing at the right time" echoing in her ears, and she wondered whether he was right or whether he was only stretching out the game, because that was what power allowed people to do. The third time, 11 days after she moved into the apartment, Corbin came later than the first 2 times, 8 o'clock at night instead of in the afternoon, and when Beckett opened the door, Paige was sitting at the table with her anatomy textbook open to chapter 12, a cold cup of coffee beside it, and the old laptop Darcy had lent her because she couldn't afford a new one. Corbin entered the room and stopped, not because Beckett blocked him or because anything was unusual, but because he saw the book. "What are you studying?" he asked. And that question was different from every question he had ever asked her. It wasn't about Monica or the panna cotta plate, or evidence or security. It was just a question, the kind ordinary people ask ordinary people. "Nursing," Paige said. She didn't expand, didn't explain, but Corbin sat down at the table across from her, and he didn't open a laptop, didn't place down an envelope, only sat there, and the silence stretched long enough for Paige to understand that he was waiting. And she decided to give him the rest, because after 3 meetings, she had begun to realize that Corbin Valetti gathered information not by asking, but by staying silent, and his silence created a space other people filled on their own. "My mother died of cancer," Paige said. 6 months in the hospital. I sat beside her every night after work and watched the nurses take care of her, and some of them were good, truly good, and some were just doing a job, and I wondered what kind I would be if I were in that position. And I knew the answer. And that's why I'm studying this book at 8 o'clock at night at someone else's table instead of sleeping. She stopped. She had said more than she intended, and she looked away, toward the cold coffee, because suddenly the room felt too small for the amount of personal truth she had just poured onto the table. Corbin was silent for a while. Then he said, "My mother opened her first restaurant when she was 28, and he said it in a different voice. One Paige hadn't heard before. Lower and slower and nearer. She told me that people who can build something from nothing never build anything small, because they already know the price of every brick." Paige looked back at him. "Is that flirting or advice?" she asked, and she didn't know why she asked it. Maybe because he was looking at her with those gray eyes beneath the faint scar, and the desk lamp was touching his face, and she needed to break whatever was forming in the space between them before it had a name. Corbin didn't smile, but something changed at the corner of his eyes. Small, almost impossible to measure. Something Paige wasn't sure she had imagined or not. "I'm not flirting," he said. "I'm acknowledging." He stood, walked to the door. Beckett closed it behind him, and Paige sat alone at the table with the anatomy textbook open to chapter 12 and the cold coffee, and realized that precision, the kind of precision that didn't waste a single word or lose a single meaning, was far more dangerous than romance. The invitation came from Beckett, not Corbin. "A short message in the morning, Mrs. Valetti wants to see you, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and an address on the outskirts of the city that forced Paige to borrow Darcy's 2012 Honda Civic to get there. She drove 40 minutes through neighborhoods that grew more and more sparse, high-rises giving way to white wooden fences and wide lawns, and when she parked in front of the house at the address Beckett had sent, she sat in the car for 1 more minute because she had prepared herself for a mansion, and what stood before her wasn't a mansion. It was large, yes, 2 stories, gray roof, but there was no iron gate, no obvious cameras, nothing that shouted money. A broad garden with roses that needed pruning, and an old oak tree shading half the front yard, and the front door was painted white with scratches near the handle, the kind of scratches made by a door opened many times by familiar hands. Lorraine opened the door, not Beckett, not a housekeeper. She opened the door the way any woman might open a door to welcome a guest in the afternoon, an apron tied around her waist, her right hand dusted with flour, and the smell of garlic sautéed in butter rushed out from behind her so strongly that Paige felt the hunger she was used to hiding suddenly wake and howl. "Come in, child," Lorraine said. "The kitchen is in the back." The kitchen was larger than Paige's entire old studio. The granite countertop had old knife marks. A wooden spice rack hung on the wall. Heavy copper pots sat on the stove, the kind of pots people didn't buy but inherited. Lorraine was making fresh pasta, her hands kneading dough on a counter dusted with flour, and she didn't stop when Paige stepped inside. She only nodded toward the chair beside the kitchen table and said, "Sit." Paige sat and watched the 62-year-old matriarch, the woman who held an empire together with ledgers and patience, knead pasta dough with her bare hands. She talked while she cooked, not looking at Paige, looking at the dough, at the pot of water, at her own hands, and her voice was flat and even, like the rhythm of the kneading. Queens, when she was 23, a small laundromat in an Italian neighborhood that her husband, Frank, had bought with borrowed money. Frank had connections. Frank had a name. But the real money, the money that kept the lights on and paid the debts, and turned one laundromat into 2, then 4, then real estate, then restaurants, that money came from her hands. From the books she kept every night after the children were asleep. From the investments the men around her laughed at when she suggested them, and stopped laughing when they saw the results. Everyone thinks women can't manage money, Lorraine said. I let them think that. It's easier to manage people when no one thinks they're being managed. Frank died 15 years ago. Lorraine didn't say what he died from, only that he died, and the way she said the word, quickly, without pausing, told Paige there was something beneath it that she wasn't ready to open. Everyone thought the empire would collapse. Men circled like vultures, thinking the widow would sell everything, divide everything, run back to Queens and fold laundry. She didn't sell. She didn't divide. She sat down at the table, opened the books, and kept everything standing with something no one could measure. The patience of a woman used to being underestimated, and knowing how to turn that into a weapon. Real power, Lorraine said, tipping the pot of pasta onto a plate, isn't guns, isn't money. It's knowing who owes whom, who fears whom, and never letting them know you know. She set the plate of pasta in front of Paige. Fresh tomato sauce, basil, thin shavings of hard cheese. The plate was full in the way only someone who had once been hungry knew how to fill a plate for someone who was hungry now. Eat, she said, and sat across from her. Paige ate, and somewhere between the third bite and the fourth, when Lorraine asked about her mother in a soft voice that wasn't pity but understanding, Paige began to talk. She talked about the hospital, about the smell of bleach, about the bills, about the final night when her mother held her hand, and that hand was so light Paige was afraid that if she held on any tighter it would break. She told things she had only ever told Darcy, and she told them to this woman because Lorraine was sitting across from her at a kitchen table with flour on her hands, and her eyes never leaving Paige's face, and Paige couldn't explain why, but it felt safe in a way Paige had forgotten. Lorraine listened until the end, silent. Then she reached across the table and took Paige's hand, her own hand warm and dry and strong, the kind of grip that wasn't comfort but anchoring. You've done enough, Lorraine said, and you'll do much more. I see that. Paige didn't cry. She had run out of tears for anything related to her mother a long time ago, or she thought she had, but something tightened in her chest, and it wasn't grief. It was recognition. The recognition that Lorraine was looking at her with the same eyes her mother had once used. Eyes that saw the future version of her before Paige herself could see it, and she had to look away because it was too much. She drove back in Darcy's Honda Civic, past white fences and lawns and the oak tree, and for the first time in 2 years since her mother had closed her eyes in that hospital bed, Paige felt as if someone was standing behind her. Monica Hale Valetti walked into the Alabaster for the first time on Tuesday of the second week, exactly at noon, taking a table for 2 by the window with a blonde woman Paige had never seen before. She ordered a salad and mineral water, laughed with her companion, and did not once look toward the service staff. But Paige knew she was looking, because 4 years in the job had taught her that people who were truly watching never let you catch them doing it. The second time was Friday of the same week, alone, at a table near the bar, a laptop open in front of her, though her eyes were not on the screen. She sat for 90 minutes, ordered 2 espressos, and during those 90 minutes, Paige felt Monica's gaze move across the room like a slow, sweeping searchlight, stopping on each server long enough to evaluate, then sliding to the next. She was looking, eliminating, narrowing the list with the kind of patience only someone trained could have. The third time was Wednesday of the following week, and this time Monica did not sit at a table. She came early, stood at the host stand talking to Carlton about the new menu, her voice light and charming. And then she walked past the service area, slowly, naturally, as though she were looking for the restroom, and when she passed Paige, who was folding napkins at the side station, she stopped. "Hello," Monica said, her smile warm at the edges and controlled at the center, exactly the kind of smile Paige had seen that night in the private dining room. "Have you worked here long?" 4 years, ma'am," Paige answered, her hands still folding the napkins, her eyes still on the white cloth. "Oh, that long," Monica said, her voice friendly, but her eyes were not. Her eyes scanning Paige's face the way a microscope scans a specimen. "Were you working dinner service the night of the family meal a few weeks ago?" Paige felt the question land like a slow bullet. She kept her hands steady on the napkin, kept her breathing even, kept her face in service mode. The mode 4 years had polished into a porcelain surface no one could see through. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I served the private dining room that night." Monica tilted her head. Small. Exactly the kind of tilt Lorraine had made when she asked Paige why. But with Lorraine it had been assessment. With Monica it was predatory. "Serving must be hard," Monica said. "Standing all night, watching other people eat. I've always thought the hardest part isn't the work. It's having to pretend you don't see." That sentence was not an observation. It was a hook. Paige looked up for the first time in the conversation, looked straight into Monica's eyes, and kept her own gaze empty and professional, and utterly filled with nothing except the soulless politeness the restaurant paid her meager minimum wage to maintain. "I don't pretend, ma'am," Paige said. "I truly don't look. My job is to serve, not to observe." Silence. Monica looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then the smile returned, warm and controlled, and she said, "Thank you. Have a good day," and walked away, her heels tapping evenly across the wooden floor. Paige stood at the side station with the white napkin in her hands and realized her hands were not shaking, and she didn't know whether that was good or bad, that she had become so good at hiding fear that her body could no longer tell the difference between real calm and false calm. Monica wasn't certain yet. Paige knew because if Monica were certain, that conversation would not have happened that way. But she was narrowing, crossing off names. And Paige knew she was inside the range of sight. That afternoon, Darcy stood beside Paige in the kitchen area, holding a tray, and looked at her with eyes Paige knew too well, the eyes of the only friend who didn't ask out of curiosity, but asked out of worry. "You're hiding something," Darcy said. Not a question. Paige didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't pull Darcy into this, couldn't turn the only friend she had into another target on Monica's list. Darcy looked at her a little longer. Then she nodded, lightly, without pressing, and said the only thing Paige needed to hear right then. "You know I'm here." Carlton called Paige into the small office behind the kitchen on Monday of the 3rd week, and she knew before he opened his mouth. Because Carlton never called employees into his office to praise them. He sat behind the desk, not looking at her, turning a pen between 2 fingers in the way of a man saying something he didn't want to say. "There's been a complaint," he said, "from a VIP guest, about your service attitude." Paige stood in front of Carlton's desk and listened as he read words she knew weren't his. A complaint about lack of professionalism, about inappropriate eye contact, about an attitude that crossed the boundaries of a server. And every word had Monica's fingerprints on it, every word chosen carefully enough that it couldn't be traced back, but heavy enough that Carlton had no choice. 4 years, Paige thought. 4 years she had worked here, never once late for a shift, never once complained about, never once spilling a glass or forgetting an order, and it ended with a phone call from the woman she had stopped from poisoning her mother-in-law. Carlton said, "I'm sorry, Paige," and he truly was sorry. She could see it in the way he still wouldn't look at her. But sorry didn't pay rent, and sorry didn't pay the hospital debt gathering interest every month. She cleaned out her locker in the changing room. Darcy stood beside her, red-eyed, saying, "You can't let them do this," and Paige said it's okay, and they both knew it was a lie, but neither of them had the energy to admit it. The second blow came 2 days later. Paige went back to her old studio to pick up the few things still left behind, winter clothes and the box of paperwork she hadn't had time to move to the safe apartment. She knew something was wrong the moment she touched the doorknob, because it wasn't locked, and she always locked it. Always. Because when you lived alone in a studio of 300 square feet in a part of the city that wasn't exactly the best, locking the door was a reflex that didn't require thought. Inside, nothing had been ransacked. Nothing had been smashed. That was the frightening part. Everything was almost untouched. Clothes still folded in the bag, the box of paperwork still in the corner. Only one thing was different. Darcy's old laptop, the one Paige had left on the floor beside the mattress, had been opened. The screen lifted, and when Paige touched the keyboard, it lit up on her email homepage. Someone had been here. Someone had opened the laptop. Someone had read her emails, or maybe they hadn't. But that didn't matter, because the message wasn't in what they had found. It was in the fact that they wanted her to know they could enter her home anytime they wanted, and she couldn't do a thing about it. Paige closed the laptop, put it in her bag, locked the studio door for the last time and walked out. And she didn't shake. She was done shaking. Something else had taken its place. Harder, colder. Something she hadn't known she had until it became necessary. Monica was playing a game of indirect destruction, taking away her job, taking away her sense of safety, pushing her into a corner until she ran or broke. But Monica had made one mistake in her calculation. She was playing with someone who had lost her mother, lost her home, lost her health insurance, lost sleep, lost 2 years of her life to hospital bills, and still woke up every morning. She was playing with someone who had nothing left to lose. And that kind of person, Paige knew, was the most dangerous kind. Corbin knew about the firing within 6 hours. Paige didn't ask how. He knew about the break-in at the studio before she even had the chance to tell him. Beckett had reported it. Corbin came to the safe apartment that night, and Paige saw something on his face she had never seen before. Anger. Not hot anger, not a flushed face or a raised voice, but cold anger. The kind that ran beneath the layer of control and thickened the air in the room, the kind she imagined had been the last thing many people saw before things became very bad for them. He stood in the middle of the living room, his back straight, his hand clenching, then opening, then clenching again, and he said, "This is the last time," his voice low and flat, and more dangerous than any shout. "I'm ending this tonight." Paige looked at him, looked at the clenched hand, looked at the vein rising along his wrist, looked at the gray eyes that had turned to steel, and she said the sentence she knew would stop him, because it was his own. "You told me," she said. "Power is choosing the right thing at the right time." Corbin looked at her. Something moved across his face. Quick, difficult to read. Maybe surprise. Maybe something deeper than surprise. Something Paige didn't dare name because naming it would make it real. He said nothing. His hand opened, slowly, and his shoulders lowered by 1/2 inch. And that was the whole outward reaction. But Paige knew she had just done something perhaps no one in the Valetti Empire had ever done. She had stopped him, with his own words, and he had listened. He stood there a moment longer, looking at her, and the distance between them wasn't great. 4 steps, maybe 3, and Paige realized that her real trouble wasn't Monica Hale Valetti, wasn't the lost job, wasn't the studio someone had broken into. Her real trouble was the way Corbin Valetti was looking at her right now, as if she were the only person in the world who could make him stop. And he was standing closer to her than necessary, and he didn't touch, and she didn't step back, and the space between them shrank, in the way space only shrinks, when both people know what is happening, and neither of them is ready to admit it. Nina Pryor called Corbin at 11 o'clock on Thursday night of the 3rd week. Paige knew because she was sitting at the study table when Corbin's phone rang, and he was in her apartment, the 4th or 5th time. She had lost count, and she watched his face change as he listened to Nina speak, changing the way water turns to ice, not slowly but suddenly, one moment liquid, the next moment solid and sharp. He hung up, looked at Paige, said, "You need to hear this." They went to Lorraine's house. Beckett drove, Corbin sat in the front passenger seat, Paige sat in the back, and no one said a word for the 30-minute drive. Lorraine was waiting at the kitchen table, the same table where she had made pasta for Paige. But tonight there was no smell of garlic and basil, only black coffee and a stack of papers Nina had emailed and printed, arranged neatly in front of her. Nina had traced the money. The $340,000 Monica had moved through Tristan's account over 2 years did not stop in Tristan's account. It kept flowing, through 3 layers of shell companies, through 2 banks in 2 different states, and finally into an account linked to a name Corbin knew well, Grady Crenshaw, 55 years old. Head of the Crenshaw family, an old rival of the Valetti family, the man Frank Valetti had pushed out of the city's 3 largest business territories 20 years ago and nearly wiped out completely, if Frank hadn't died before he could finish. Corbin looked at the name Crenshaw on the paper, and Paige saw his jaw tighten, the muscle rising along the bone, the reflex of a man holding something very large behind his teeth. But Nina had found more, and this part changed everything. Monica was not a spy Crenshaw had planted. No one had recruited her, no one had trained her, no one had sent her into the Valetti house with a blueprint and a target. Monica Hale Valetti had found Grady Crenshaw on her own, by herself, after 2 years of marriage to Tristan, and the reason lay in a name Nina had dug up from county public records, bankruptcy records, death records, the kind of paperwork no one searches unless they already know what to look for. Wesley Hale, Monica's father. the owner of a small grocery store on the outskirts of the city 20 years ago. Frank Valetti wanted the land that store stood on for a real estate development project. Wesley refused to sell. Frank was not used to being refused. What happened afterward was in the court records Nina had printed and laid on the table. Lawsuits, enforcement orders, loan agreements with interest rates anyone could look at and recognize as a trap, and Wesley Hale, the man with the small grocery store and a 10-year-old daughter, was bankrupt within 8 months. He killed himself 6 weeks after losing the store. Monica was 10 years old, foster care, independent at 16, enlisted at 18, 6 years as an Army combat medic. Discharged, she later met Tristan at a veterans charity event, sponsored by the Valetti family, and became his wife. She built a life with him, and in her own twisted way, she truly loved him. Paige believed that because she had seen the way Monica held Tristan's hand under the table that night, a gesture too raw to be completely faked. But then Monica found out. Maybe it was an old photograph, a story Tristan told about his father, a name on a business document. Paige didn't know the details and no one knew, but at some point during the first 2 years of marriage, Monica discovered that the family she had married into was the family that had killed her father. And love, the real thing, the thing she had held in her hands, the way a thirsty person holds water, was swallowed by 20 years of hatred she hadn't known she carried until it had a name and an address. Lorraine listened as Nina read everything. She sat still the entire time, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, not drinking. And when Nina stopped, the kitchen was silent for so long that Paige could hear the clock on the wall behind the stove. Then Lorraine spoke, her voice not trembling, but thinner than usual, thin in the way steel becomes thin when it has been bent almost to the breaking point. Frank wasn't a saint, she said. I've known that for 15 years. Silence. No one asked what she knew. No one needed to ask. Lorraine had lived with Frank Valetti through more than 20 years of marriage, had watched him build an empire with her books and his methods, and she had chosen not to look at those methods, or had looked and chosen to turn away, and now those methods were sitting at her kitchen table, in the shape of a 30-year-old daughter-in-law who wanted to kill her. Corbin stood beside the kitchen counter. Paige stood in the corner of the room, where she always stood, the corner where servers stood, the corner where invisible people stood, and from that corner she saw what no one else in the room saw, because Lorraine was looking at her coffee cup, and Nina was looking at the papers, and Beckett was watching the door. Corbin collapsed, not collapsed as in falling or shouting or slamming his hand on the table, collapsed in the sense that his shoulders lowered, suddenly, as if the cord holding him upright had been cut, and his hand gripped the edge of the counter behind him, his fingers tightening white against the wood, and his eyes, those cold gray eyes Paige had seen so many times and had always found full of steel, turned wet. 5 seconds. Paige counted because she didn't know what else to do except count. 5 seconds in which Corbin Valetti, the 37-year-old boss who had carried the empire since he was 22 and had never let anyone see him weak, allowed himself to digest the truth that his father had created the enemy now trying to kill his mother, that the pain Monica carried was not invented, not an excuse, but real. Real in the way only a 10-year-old child who had lost her father could know, and Corbin knew that kind of real, because he had lost his father too, except his father was the man who had caused that other loss. The 6th second. His shoulders straightened. His hand released the counter. His eyes dried. His face returned to steel. And Paige stood in the kitchen corner and understood that she had never seen anyone truly strong until that moment. Because real strength was not never collapsing. It was collapsing for 5 seconds and rebuilding yourself in the 6th. Corbin chose the penthouse to talk to Tristan. Not his mother's house, not the restaurant, not anywhere with family memories clinging to the walls. Because what he was about to say would destroy enough things without needing a backdrop. Paige was in the room next door, not because Corbin had invited her, but because Beckett had placed her there, and she didn't ask why. And the door between the 2 rooms was closed but not soundproof, and this apartment of concrete, glass, and steel echoed like an empty church. She heard everything. Tristan arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his voice light as he stepped inside, asking, "What did you want to see me about?" And Paige heard the sound of a chair being pulled across the concrete floor and Corbin beginning to speak, flatly, without emotion, reading the truth the way one might read a financial report. The money trail. $340,000 through Tristan's account that Tristan didn't know about. Shell companies, Grady Crenshaw, Then the hardest part. Wesley Hale, the grocery store. Frank Valetti, bankruptcy, suicide. Monica at 10 years old, foster care. And then silence, long and heavy. The kind of silence Paige could feel through the closed door like a shift in air pressure. Then Tristan spoke, and his voice was no longer light. "What are you saying?" Corbin repeated it. "Evidence. Nina. Records. The truth." Tristan said no. Only one word, but it was larger than any word Paige had ever heard in this apartment. "No. Monica wouldn't do that. She loves me. She loves Mom. You don't know her the way I do." Corbin said, "Little brother, listen to me." And Tristan said, "You're always like this," his voice climbing, moving from denial to anger in the space of a few breaths. "You always think you know everything. You always control everything. Control the empire. Control Mom. Control me. And now you want to control my marriage too." Paige heard a strike, a hand hitting the tabletop, hard enough to make her flinch on her side of the door. "This is how you destroy the only marriage that has ever made me happy," Tristan said, and his voice broke on the last word, broke in the way a man's voice only breaks when something inside him is being torn apart faster than he can stitch it back together. "You're jealous. You've always been jealous because I have someone who loves me, and you sit alone in this concrete box with Mom's picture on the shelf and think that's enough." Footsteps. Fast. The front door opening. Tristan said one more sentence, lower, but Paige still heard it. The sentence she knew would drive deeper into Corbin than everything that came before it. "I choose my wife." The door closed. The elevator. Silence. Paige waited 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then she opened the door of the side room and stepped out. Corbin was sitting at the dining table, in the same place he had sat the first time she came here, the day he asked why she had interfered, and she said, "Because I watched a woman die." He didn't look at her when she came in. He didn't look at the door Tristan had just walked through. He was looking at the bookshelf, at the only photograph in the entire penthouse, the picture of young Lorraine holding 2 babies, one in each arm, laughing the kind of laugh meant for no one except the 2 children in her embrace. The 2 babies in that photograph, one was Corbin, one was Tristan, and now one of them had just walked out that door and chosen to stand beside the woman trying to kill their mother. Paige looked at Corbin, and she saw something in him she had never seen before. Different from the 5-second collapse in Lorraine's kitchen. Different from the cold anger when he learned she had been fired. This was loneliness, the real kind. The kind that didn't come from living alone in an empty penthouse, but from reaching out to the person you loved most and being pushed away. Paige didn't say he'll come back, didn't say everything will be all right, didn't say any of the cheap consolations people offer when they don't know what else to say, because she had heard enough of them when her mother was sick, and not one of them had helped. She sat down beside him, at the table, looking at the same photograph without looking at each other. And she said nothing. She was only there. The silence stretched on. Not 3 seconds, not 5 seconds, but longer. Long enough for the sunlight through the glass to shift its angle across the concrete floor, and Paige sat inside that silence and realized this was the first time the silence between her and Corbin was not caution, not someone weighing what should be said, but because both of them were safe enough with each other not to fill the empty space with words. The idea was Lorraine's. She called Corbin one morning, her voice calm as though she were discussing buying flowers for the garden and not setting a trap for her daughter-in-law, and said they should have a family dinner. At the Alabaster, in the private dining room. The surface reason was reconciliation after the time Tristan had gotten sick. The whole family needed to sit down, needed to talk, needed to heal. Lorraine said the word heal in a flat voice and with sharp eyes, and Paige, sitting at Lorraine's kitchen table while she spoke on the phone, understood that in Lorraine's mouth, that word meant something entirely different from its ordinary meaning. Corbin called Tristan. Tristan didn't answer. Corbin called a second time. No answer. Lorraine called. Tristan answered on the first ring. "I want the family to have dinner together," Lorraine said, and she said it in the voice no child could refuse, even when that child was 33 years old and angry enough at his older brother not to answer his calls. Tristan said yes, and Monica would come too. Of course she would come. She needed Lorraine, needed to be near Lorraine, needed one more chance to reach the woman she had failed to bring down the first time, and a family dinner was an open door she couldn't walk through fast enough. The plan was assembled over 3 days. Beckett came to the Alabaster 2 days early, spoke with the building's technical manager, adjusted the angles of the security cameras in the private dining room. 3 cameras, 3 angles, covering the entire side table, the main table, and the drink area. Nina Pryor booked a table in the main dining room, right outside the private dining room, laptop open, watching Monica and Tristan's accounts in real time, because Corbin suspected that if Lorraine was taken down tonight, Monica would move money immediately during the chaotic hours that followed. And Paige returned to the Alabaster at 5 o'clock that afternoon, entering through the kitchen door, the door she had walked through thousands of times in 4 years, and Carlton was waiting inside. He knew just enough. Corbin had called him. Said just enough for Carlton to understand that tonight mattered, and Paige needed to be there, and there should be no questions. Carlton looked at Paige, looked for a long time, and he didn't apologize for firing her, but that look held something close to it, and then he nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. Darcy stood in the napkin station. She watched Paige walk in, wearing the black uniform and white apron she had returned 3 weeks earlier, and Darcy's face moved through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, then worry, then something harder, something like resolve. Darcy didn't ask. She stepped forward and hugged Paige, fast and tight, the kind of hug that didn't need an explanation, because 28 years of life had taught Darcy Owens that sometimes your best friend puts her old uniform back on at night, and you don't ask why. You just hug her and let her go do what she needs to do. By 6:30, the private dining room was ready. The same black oak table, the same white candles, the same lilies. Paige arranged the plates and glasses and napkins and dessert spoons, and every motion was so familiar that her body did it on its own, while her mind was somewhere else. On the cameras Beckett had installed, on Nina sitting outside with her laptop open, on Corbin standing somewhere in the building, waiting with the cold patience Paige had learned to recognize. Lorraine arrived first. Deliberately, she stepped into the private dining room more slowly than last time, her back slightly bent, her left hand resting on the edge of the table as though she needed support. And when Paige poured her water, she coughed softly, twice, a dry, thin cough, and she said, "Thank you, child," in a voice slower than usual, weaker than usual, the hand holding the glass trembling lightly. Paige watched her perform and had to work not to let admiration show on her face, because Lorraine Valetti, 62 years old, the woman who had kept an empire standing when every man thought she would fall, was playing the role of a frail old woman so well that Paige almost would have believed it if she hadn't caught Lorraine's eyes in the reflection on the wall mirror, sharp and awake and counting. Corbin arrived next, calm, in a black suit with no tie, sitting to his mother's right as he had last time, everything identical, everything in place, a perfect copy of an ordinary family dinner. Then Tristan and Monica walked in. Tristan wore a pale blue shirt, no suit, and he didn't look at Corbin as he passed. He looked straight at Lorraine, bent down to embrace his mother, and Paige saw his hand tighten on her shoulder, as if he were protecting her from his own older brother. Monica followed behind her husband, in a silver-gray dress tonight, her hair pinned up, and she embraced Lorraine with both arms. But Paige knew what to watch for, and Monica's left hand still hovered an inch away from Lorraine's back, still embracing without touching, still performing without feeling, exactly like the first time. Paige poured the wine. Dinner began, and everything looked normal, looked like family, looked like healing. And Paige stepped back into the service hallway, stood behind the frosted glass, exactly where she had stood the last time, and looked at the kitchen clock through the crack in the door. 9:47. The second time. Paige looked through the glass. Monica stood up at 9:47. Paige knew because she was watching the kitchen clock through the crack in the door, and that number had carved itself into her like a scar. 9:47. The moment Monica Hale Valetti went to work, and this time was no different. But the method was different. Through the frosted glass, Paige watched Monica rise, say something to Tristan, smile softly, then move toward the side table where the water pitcher and glasses had been set out. And this time she didn't touch the food. She stood beside the tray of glasses, her back angled slightly to block the view, and her right hand moved over Lorraine's water glass, the glass Paige had placed in the exact position to the right of her plate when setting the table, the glass with the fan-folded napkin beside it that only Lorraine used because she didn't drink wine during dinner, only still water, and Monica knew that because she had sat at the same table with her mother-in-law for 4 years and knew what Lorraine drank, where she drank it, and which glass was hers. 3 seconds, just like last time. The clutch opened, the right hand tilted, the eyes swept the room, the clutch closed, And Paige stood behind the frosted glass for the second time in her life and watched the same hand make the same motion, and this time she didn't freeze. This time she didn't need 3 seconds to decide what kind of person she was, because she had decided that 5 weeks ago, and the answer had not changed. She pushed open the hallway door, stepped into the private dining room, water pitcher in her hand, and walked straight to Lorraine's table, with the professional server's smile that 4 years had polished into reflex. "Would you like more water, ma'am?" she said. And without waiting for an answer, she lifted Lorraine's water glass, the one Monica had just touched, lifting it with her right hand around the middle of the glass, and set a new glass down with her left hand, poured water from the pitcher, smooth, natural, in the right rhythm, at the right angle. And no one in the room looked twice because that was what servers did. Poured water, changed glasses, remained invisible. But this time Paige didn't place the old glass on the tray and carry it back to the kitchen. She carried it into the hallway, where Beckett Shaw was waiting with his large hands and expressionless face, and she handed him the glass. Beckett took it, slid it into a clear plastic evidence bag already prepared, sealed it, labeled it, wrote the date and time, and did not say a word. Paige returned to the room, stood in the corner. Dinner continued. Lorraine drank from the new glass, coughed lightly. Her hand trembled. She kept performing. Tristan held Monica's hand under the table and talked to his mother about the new restaurant he was managing. His voice warm, trying, the voice of a man building a bridge out of words between himself and the mother he believed was weakening. Corbin ate, spoke little, watched, and only Paige saw his finger tapping lightly against the edge of the table beneath the napkin. Steady, counting down. 10 o'clock. Dinner ended. Dessert was served. No one got sick this time, and Monica began to look confused. She hid it well, Paige had to admit. But 4 years of reading rich people's faces had taught her to recognize when someone was checking the script inside her head and could not find the next line. Monica looked at Lorraine, waiting for the sign, waiting for a real tremor instead of a staged one, waiting for dull eyes, a slowing voice, any symptom showing that the sedative was working, and there was nothing. Lorraine sat straight, drank water, talked, and nothing happened. Paige watched confusion pass through Monica's eyes like the shadow of a cloud crossing sunlight, quick, almost invisible, but there. Then Corbin set down his wineglass. "Sit down." 2 words. He said 2 words, and his voice was no louder than the voice he had used all evening. But those 2 words cut through the private dining room like a knife through silk, and everything stopped. Tristan, Monica, Lorraine, Paige in the corner, the air in the room, everything stopped. "Sit down." Not directed at anyone in particular because they were all already seated. It was an order for everyone, an order for the room, an order for the situation. And Monica, who had begun shifting in her chair as if preparing to stand, sat back down. The private dining room door closed. Paige heard the soft click and knew Beckett was standing outside. No one came in. No one went out. Corbin took a tablet from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed it on the table, opened it, turned the screen toward Monica, and on the screen was the grainy, obscured footage from the first night. While the camera had only caught a suspicious shadow at the side table, it was Paige's precise eyewitness testimony that had decoded Monica's hidden movements, proving exactly how she had targeted Lorraine. Then he switched to the footage from tonight, slowed down, Monica beside the tray of glasses. The same motion, the same angle of the back, the same hand, the second time. Then he opened Nina's file, the money trail, $340,000. Tristan's account, shell companies, Grady Crenshaw, layer by layer, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, laying them on the table like cards turned face up. Monica looked at the screen. Her face did not collapse. It shut, like an iron door dropping, fast, complete. And behind it, there was no longer a smile warm at the edges, no longer control at the center, only a blank surface, and 2 eyes calculating so quickly that Paige could almost see the numbers running behind her pupils. Tristan looked at the tablet, looked at the footage of his wife standing at the side table, her hand over his mother's plate. Looked at the second footage, his wife at the tray of glasses, her hand over his mother's water glass. He stood, the chair pushed back, and the whole room held its breath because no one knew whose side he was on. He had chosen Monica 3 weeks ago, had slammed his hand on the table and walked out and said, "I choose my wife," and now he was standing in the Alabaster's private dining room with the evidence on the tablet, and his wife seated on his left, and his brother seated on his right, and his mother seated across from him, and he looked at Monica, then at Corbin, then back at Monica, and he still had not sat down. The private dining room stayed silent long enough for Paige to hear the candles burning. Tristan stood in the middle of the room, both arms hanging at his sides, and every eye poured toward him like water running to the lowest place, waiting, and Monica was the one who broke the silence first. But she didn't say the sentence everyone in the room was waiting for. She didn't say, "I'm innocent." Didn't say, "Tristan, my love, trust me." Didn't say, "This is a misunderstanding," or "I was framed," or any of the words an accused wife would say if she truly wanted to save her marriage. Instead, Monica looked at Lorraine, looked straight at her, and said, "Wesley Hale." 2 words. They fell onto the black oak table among white candles and lilies like a bullet dropped onto a porcelain plate. Corbin did not react. He already knew. Lorraine did not react. She already knew. But Tristan stood in the middle of the room with those 2 words hanging in the air, and his face said he did not know, had never heard that name before. And Monica looked at her husband for 1 second, then turned back to Lorraine and continued. "My father," Monica said, and her voice was entirely different from every other time Paige had ever heard it. Not warm, not controlled, not performed, only steel and 20 years of hatred melted down into words. "My father's name was Wesley Hale. He had a small grocery store. He had that store for 12 years. He knew every customer by name. He let me sit on the checkout counter every Saturday afternoon and gave me peppermints from the jar beside the cash register. Then, your husband wanted that land." Monica went on, short, precise, without one unnecessary detail, telling them how Frank Valetti had pressured her father to sell, how her father had refused, the loan agreement, the suffocating interest rate, 8 months from grocery store to bankruptcy papers, and 6 weeks after that, her father went into the garage, closed the door, started the car, and never came out again. 10 years old, Monica said. "I was 10 years old, and they put me into foster care, and I stayed there until I was old enough for the army to take me." She spent years in the military as an army combat medic, sharpening her skills in grit and survival. "I rebuilt myself from the wreckage your family left behind." She stopped, looked at Lorraine. "Do you want to hear how he died?" It wasn't a question. It was a knife. And that was Monica Hale Valetti's final mistake. Because in the moment she chose to tell the truth about her father, instead of lying about her love for her husband. She confirmed in front of everyone in the room that her 4 years of marriage to Tristan had not been love, but a campaign. That every time she had called Lorraine mom, it had been a bullet being loaded into the chamber. That every night she lay beside Tristan had been a night she lay beside the son of the enemy and waited for her moment. She could have said, "I love Tristan, and this is a misunderstanding." And she might have kept him, might have pulled him to her side one more time because Tristan loved her, truly loved her, and blind love was the strongest weapon she had. But Monica did not choose that weapon. She chose the truth, and the truth killed everything the lie had built. Tristan sat down, slowly, as if his bones were softening, as if gravity had suddenly doubled just for him. He sat down in the chair, both hands on the table, his eyes on Monica, and Paige realized that Tristan's silence now was entirely different from the silence 3 weeks earlier, when he had slammed his hand on the table in Corbin's penthouse. 3 weeks earlier had been the silence of denial, of a man not ready to believe. This was the silence of a man who had just heard the answer to the question he feared most, the question he had carried from the first night she had hugged him at the Veterans Charity event until now. The question was whether she had truly loved him, and the answer had come not from Corbin's mouth, or from the evidence on the tablet, but from Monica's own mouth, and it was no. Lorraine looked at Monica. She had remained silent the entire time Monica spoke, sitting with her back straight, her hands on the table, the strand of pearls at her throat, and her face in the candlelight looked carved. But Paige stood in the corner of the room and saw something she had not expected on Lorraine's face. Not only outrage, there was something else, something more complicated, more painful, something like recognition, as though she was looking at Monica and seeing the 10-year-old child who had lost her father and the cost of the empire she had helped build. "You called me Mom for 4 years, Lorraine said, and her voice did not tremble, but it carried weight, each word heavy as stone. "For 4 years, you sat at my dinner table and hugged me every Christmas, and I let you into my home because I thought you loved my son." Monica did not answer. Her eyes moved, quick, scanning the room with the instinct of someone searching for an exit. The main door closed. Beckett outside. A sixth-floor window. No way out. And her eyes kept moving until they stopped in the corner of the room, on the black uniform and white apron, on the face she had looked at but never truly seen, on the waitress she had questioned pleasantly at the restaurant and tried to bait with a hook of a sentence, and fired with a false complaint, and threatened by breaking into her studio. And only now, only in this moment when every mask had fallen, did Monica truly see Paige. "You," Monica said. Her voice was cold, sharp, stripped of every covering. The waitress. And Paige looked at Monica from the corner of the room. From the position where she had stood, through both times Monica had made her move, both times Paige had silently changed the position of a plate and a glass without anyone knowing, both times she had stood between Monica and everything Monica wanted. And Monica had never even realized it. Paige said nothing. She looked at Monica and kept her face blank. The server's face. The invisible face. The face 4 years and $11.40 an hour had bought, and that silence was heavier than anything she could have said, because it contained everything. The panna cotta plate, the water glass. Lorraine saying thank you, Corbin asking why, her mother in a hospital bed, the 3-second decision. All of it inside that silence, and Monica looked into it and, for the first time in 4 years of manipulation and calculation and perfect performance, understood that she had lost. Not to the Valetti family, not to Corbin or Lorraine or cameras or evidence, but to an invisible server whom she had never bothered to look at twice. Monica left the private dining room that night between 2 men Beckett had chosen, not the police, because the Valetti family did not call the police. 2 silent men walking on either side while Monica walked between them in her silver-gray dress, her hair still neatly pinned, her back still straight, because even in defeat, she lost with the posture of someone who had once worn a uniform. Paige did not watch her go. She stood in the corner of the private dining room and looked at Tristan sitting motionless at the table, both hands flat on the black oak, his eyes fixed on the empty chair beside him, the chair where his wife had just been sitting. And he did not cry, did not speak, only sat there with the face of a man who had just had all the air pulled from his lungs and had not yet remembered how to breathe. Corbin sat across from his younger brother. He said nothing, did not touch him. He was simply there, and Paige realized he was doing for Tristan what she had done for him in the penthouse the week before. Simply being present, not filling the hollow space with words. The following week was paperwork. Corbin handled everything with the precision Paige had come to recognize as his language of love. Not words, not gestures, but actions calculated to protect the people he cared about. Tristan and Monica's marriage was annulled. Every account Monica had touched was frozen within 48 hours, handled by Nina. Fast, clean, accurate down to the last cent as always. The evidence, the footage from both nights, the money trail, the Crenshaw connection, was sent to Grady Crenshaw through a channel Paige did not know and did not ask about, but the message was clear. Monica had failed, Crenshaw knew she had failed, and in this world, people who failed had no allies. Monica had nowhere left to hide. Not on the Valetti side, not on Crenshaw's side, no side at all. Corbin met with Grady Crenshaw privately. Paige was not there. She did not know where the meeting took place, how long it lasted, or what Corbin said. She only knew that after the meeting, Crenshaw withdrew from 3 disputed business territories with the Valettis, without a single gunshot, without a public threat. And Lorraine commented when she heard the news, her voice flat, "My son does not need a gun. He only needs to sit at the right table and say the right sentence." But the part Paige had not expected, the part no one had expected, happened quietly, without Corbin, without Beckett, without traps or cameras. Nina called Paige one afternoon, and her voice was different from usual. Not the voice of an accountant reading numbers, but the voice of someone who had just seen something that made her stop and think. Lorraine had just made a wire transfer. The amount was not large by family standards, but large enough for Nina to notice. The receiving account carried the name Wesley Hale. Paige heard that name and needed a few seconds to understand. Wesley Hale. Monica's father. The man with the small grocery store, Frank Valetti, had driven into bankruptcy 20 years earlier. Lorraine had opened an account in the dead man's name and transferred money into it, an amount that on paper looked like compensation, like payment, like the Valetti family finally acknowledging that there was a debt no one wanted to speak of, but everyone knew existed. Paige went to Lorraine's house, uninvited. For the first time, She came without anyone calling her. And when Lorraine opened the door, she did not look surprised, as if she had been waiting for this question. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lorraine had made pasta, and Paige asked why. Lorraine was silent for a while. Then she spoke, and her voice was not flat this time. There was something underneath it, something Paige recognized as regret. Not because it was new, but because it had been there for a very long time, and Lorraine was finally allowing it to have a name. "My husband wasn't a saint," Lorraine said, "and I've pretended not to know long enough." She looked at Paige. "That money will not fix anything. It will not bring her father back. It will not erase 10 years of foster care, but it is the only thing I can do besides continuing to pretend." Paige sat with Lorraine a while longer, and neither of them said anything more because some things do not need more words. Tristan came to his mother's house at 2 o'clock in the morning. Lorraine told Paige the next day, told it briefly, without detail, the way she told everything, only enough to understand. He drove from the empty apartment, the apartment Monica had cleared out that day, and parked in front of his mother's house, and stood at the door in a wrinkled suit with dry eyes, dry in a way worse than crying because crying was release, and dry was when the pain was too large to leave through tears. "I did not know where else to go," Tristan said. Lorraine opened the door wider. "You are here now." He stepped inside. She made tea. They sat at the kitchen table until morning. Tristan began seeing a therapist the following week, arranged by Corbin, the appointment scheduled, the doctor chosen. Because that was how Corbin loved, not through words but through structure, through plans, through clearing the road for someone he cared about to walk forward. The Valetti family was damaged. Monica had left a hole in Tristan that would take months to mend. The name Wesley Hale hung over the family's history like a ghost that refused to lie still. And Lorraine carried one more truth on her shoulders, a truth she had tried to avoid for 15 years. But they remained standing, as always. Not whole, but standing. Paige packed her things on Saturday afternoon of the 6th week. There wasn't much. One bag of clothes, her nursing textbook, Darcy's old laptop, and the nameless white business card Lorraine had placed on the table that first night. The business card Paige still kept even though she no longer needed the phone number on it. The agreement was over. Monica was gone. Crenshaw had backed off. The family was safe. And according to the condition Paige had set in Corbin's penthouse 6 weeks earlier, when everything was finished, she would leave. She was zipping the bag shut when there was a knock at the door. Not Beckett. Beckett didn't knock. Beckett opened doors. Paige opened it, and Corbin stood on the threshold. Black suit with no tie, the faint scar across his eyebrow, shadows beneath his gray eyes, and he did not step inside. He looked at the bag on the bed, looked at the room that was emptier than it had been that morning, then looked at her. "Stay." One word. Not an order this time. It was thinner, closer. And Paige heard inside that word something she didn't think Corbin Valetti knew how to make. Vulnerability. "Why?" she asked. Corbin was silent. He stood in the doorway and stayed silent long enough for Paige to think he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, slowly, word by word, as if each word had to be pulled from somewhere very deep that he was not used to opening. "Because I don't remember the last time anyone made me want to become a real person." Paige looked at him, looked at the 37-year-old man who had carried an empire since he was 22, who had sat alone in an empty penthouse with one photograph of his mother on the shelf and called that enough, who had collapsed for 5 seconds in his mother's kitchen and rebuilt himself in the 6th, now standing outside her apartment door and saying "stay" in a voice she had never heard him use with anyone. "You don't need to become a better man," she said. "You need to become a real one." Corbin looked at her, and something changed on his face. Not a smile. Corbin didn't smile the way ordinary people smiled, but something in his eyes, in the lines around them, something Paige recognized as the relief of a person who had just been seen exactly as he was and had not been turned away. She set conditions. Because she was Paige Lawson, and Paige Lawson did not step into any room unless she knew she could step back out. "I pay my own debt with money I earn. You don't fix my life for me. I don't become property of the family. And if one day I decide to leave, you let me go." Corbin nodded at each condition, slowly, seriously, the nod of a man who understood that this was not negotiation but boundaries. Then he stopped at the last one. "All of them," he said, "except the last." "Why?" "Because I won't let you want to leave. And Paige stood in the apartment where she had lived for 6 weeks. The apartment with windows large enough to see the sky, and a desk for studying, and a kitchen with a refrigerator, the right size, and she looked at Corbin Valetti standing at the door, not stepping inside because he was waiting for her to invite him, and she understood there was a difference between dependence and freedom. Dependence was when someone kept the door closed. Freedom was when the door was open and you chose to stay. She chose to stay. The next morning, Paige woke up alone in the apartment. She had not moved in with Corbin. The relationship had only just begun. And she was not the kind of person who jumped into anything without checking how deep it was first. She made coffee, sat by the large window, the window she had stood before 6 weeks earlier, and felt anger instead of gratitude. She opened her nursing textbook, Chapter 15, The Respiratory System. She studied. Her phone vibrated. A message from Darcy. Coffee this afternoon. I found a new job lead for you. Call me. A message from Lorraine. Come to Sunday dinner. I'm making pasta. Bring that death-defying appetite of yours. A message from Corbin. No words. A photograph. Sunrise taken from the penthouse. The first gold light of day touching the city skyline. And in the lower right corner of the photograph was the building where Paige was sitting. He had been looking toward her at sunrise. And she sat there with coffee and her nursing textbook and $180,000 in medical debt, and her first smile in a very long time. She still owed money. She still studied at 1 o'clock in the morning. She still did not have a degree, but she was no longer alone. And the difference between being alone and not being alone was not in the money in your account or the roof over your head. It was in who looked toward you at sunrise. Paige looked out the window. Outside, on the narrow windowsill, there was a small pot of marigolds someone had planted before she moved in. And she had never asked who planted them, but they were still alive, orange and yellow and stubborn. The kind of flowers that did not need much water, did not need good soil, only enough light not to give up. They were still alive. So was she. Paige Lawson, 27 years old, $11.40 an hour. And that was how much it was worth to know the right thing, do the right thing, and stand firm when everything tried to pull you down. As it turned out, it was worth everything. This story is not only about family or power or conspiracy. It is about dignity, about the fact that every human being, no matter where they stand in society, no matter how much money they earn an hour, deserves to be seen, to be respected, to be treated as a person and not as furniture. Lorraine picked up a napkin for a waitress. Paige switched a plate for a matriarch. Two women from opposite ends of the world saw each other and chose to protect each other. Not because of money, not because of power, but because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes courage does not need a gun. Sometimes it only needs a girl making $11.40 an hour to switch a plate without saying a word. And sometimes the healthiest love is the love you enter with your eyes open, with clear boundaries, with the freedom to leave at any time, but choosing to stay because you want to, not because you need to. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of something in your real life, of the times you were underestimated, the times you stood firm when everything tried to pull you down, the times you chose to do the right thing even when no one was watching, please share it in the comments below. We want to listen to your story, to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every story deserves to be told, and every person deserves to be heard. If you found this video meaningful, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories every day. We sincerely thank you for staying until the very last minute. We wish you and the people you love good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.